Prince Moulay Hicham, dear guests. My name is Amir Laham, and I am the president of the Harvard Arab Alumni Association, the HAAA. It is my privilege to welcome you to the opening of the Harvard Arab Weekend, a conference that has become an annual tradition to many around the world. In 2011, the Harvard Arab Weekend was commended by the White House as the premier Arab World Conference in North America. This year's conference builds on this primacy, as it has already surpassed its predecessors in many ways. This year, we have the highest number of registered attendees of all past years at north of 800. This is a 45% increase over our best record to date, 45%. Also outstanding is this year's conference's theme, Cherish, Challenge, and Change. While the uniqueness and versatility of this theme is self-evident, I personally find the Cherish component especially relevant. Being a standing stage for conflict and political turmoil, our region leaves us little room to appreciate the greatness of our civilization and culture. Cherishing is also about taking the time to gratefully reflect on the lives we lead, built on the shoulders of those that chartered our long and proud history. As I share with you the accomplishments of this conference, I cannot help but be thankful for the monumental effort student organizers have put into its production, in coordination with us, the HAAA. The co-chairs of this year's conference, Noor, Safia, Yazan, have been exemplary leaders that have worked with a team of 42 student volunteers, the HAAA board, and many other parties to deliver this phenomenal conference. I also would like to recognize Sina Al-Halabi, the HAAA Executive Director, who continues to be our institutional work engine in supporting the administration of this conference. Neither would have this conference been possible without the generous support of our sponsors at all levels, many of which are global corporations that see the promise of our region and have significantly invested to grow their teams and operations in the Arab world. I especially thank our platinum sponsors, starting with Booz & Company, our longest standing sponsor who has been with us since 2007. Other generous platinum sponsors include Bank Audi, OCI, Saudi Aramco, and OCP. The mission of the HAAA is to bring Harvard to the Arab world and the Arab world to Harvard. Today, we are bringing the best of the Arab world to this university. In addition to this conference, the HAAA has two initiatives that aim to bring the best and the brightest of Arabs to Harvard. First is our scholarship fund, which we inaugurated in 2011. We are proud that with us today are two students that are the recipients of this fund's support. Playing a part in enabling two students every year to have a Harvard education gives us fulfillment and makes the work of our board in raising the scholarship fund well worth the effort. The second initiative is Project Harvard Admissions, in which we work closely with the admissions office and the Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs to reach out to students in the Arab world, to encourage them to apply, and to counsel them in making their case to come here. As a result of this work, we would like to believe the HAAA played a role in almost doubling the number of Arab students admitted to Harvard from 68 in 2009 to 120 today. To us, HAAA board members, it is initiatives like these that have made serving on the board a shining highlight of our volunteer career. Sadly for me, as the outgoing president, this is the last year I will have the honor to address this conference from this platform. Standing here has been a privilege every year it was afforded to me. Coming to this conference has always reinvigorated that sense of boundless possibility with which I graduated back in 2006. Attending the Harvard Arab Weekend was the antidote to the tampering effects of life's imperfections. And this is exactly the reason I know I will be amongst you comes November of next year. Prince Moulay Hicham, dear guests, please allow me to close by wishing you all a great, great weekend. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Prince Moulay Hicham. Just 1 second. Tonight, Moulay Hicham will discuss the implications of the wave of change that has spread throughout the region, how external forces and internal dynamics are fusing together to set the foundation for new social contracts between the people and their leaders. Moulay Hicham is not foreign to these dynamics, as he has been an advocate of change for the past 20 years, challenging the status quo and pushing for institutional reforms in a region he cherishes, the Arab world. He's a prolific writer on these issues, and his foundation has in particular led several initiatives for scholarly research on the region, both at Princeton and Stanford, among others. He has also worked tremendously on the ground. He served as principal officer for community affairs with the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Kosovo in 2000, and worked with the Carter Center to monitor elections in Palestine in 1996 and 2006. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Prince Moulay Hicham to the stage.
Thank you, Ahmed. I am very humbled and honored by these kind remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all to be here. Students, faculty, members of the Harvard community at large, and a special thanks to everyone in the AAA. This is a very important effort, and this is a very important contribution you're making to the region in this historic moment. Breeding the cross-fertilization of ideas, fostering understanding, fostering dialogue. And I am extremely privileged to contribute in a very small way to doing this, or in doing this. And rather than calling it the premier conference on the area or on the Arab world, like the White House dubs it, I've seen so many countrymen, I think we should call it the premier Moroccan conference. There is no other place than doing this and in this fine campus. Of course, the second greatest university in North America. So without delay, I will address you. I will try to keep this short, to keep this 30 minutes so we can use the excess time in fostering dialogue, because I would like to learn from all of you. So taking back, reclaiming the Arab Spring. This is how I decided to dub this talk, which is a series of remarks, of ideas, which I'm going to submit to you. And of course, they're not the final word on this, but they're just very preliminary thoughts as this Arab Spring is still unfolding before us. Among the three themes of this year's Harvard Arab Weekend Conference is, of course, challenge. The act of questioning assumptions, confronting truths, and contesting the realities given to us. If anything, the Arab Spring is a challenge in all of its dimensions. It's a challenge to authoritarian rule, a challenge of classical Orientalist views of the Arab world, which in its very destructive and disruptive form is like the neocon vision of the region, which made the diagnosis of these Arab societies, namely that there was something deeply wrong in the Arab psyche and it needed remedial, and the only way we could do it was through intervention. And finally, it's a challenge against the view that the destiny of Arabs and the destiny of the Arab world is made and decided not by the Arabs themselves, but by the West. We, for decades, have interiorized this feeling of defeat. We have interiorized weakness, and it has literally prevented us from doing anything. The Arab Spring has shattered all that. Further, the way that external forces have fashioned, reshaped, and appropriated the Arab Spring requires us to challenge the geopolitical, sectarian, and ideological dimensions of this Arab Spring. We must challenge the reality now that the Arab world unfortunately serves as a battleground for competing strategic interests, for competing global interests, and a competition between Sunni, Shia Islam, as well as an arena of conflict between Islamism and secularism. By doing so, we can reappropriate the struggles occurring across the region and reclaim the historical moment, for we should not forget what the Arab Spring is about. At the core, the Arab Spring is about a deep yearning for self-determination. The Arab Spring has been an open-ended process of transformation, with every country and every struggle exhibiting a very unique local character. It had two phases. The first phase was a broad regional shock in which a wave of contention and uprisings diffused throughout the region, shattering the facade of authoritarian rule. And the reappropriation or the reclaim of citizens of their voices. The second phase, of course, was this nationalization of this wave in two ways. Domestic structural factors began to weigh into the equation, and on the other side, just as importantly, outside narratives driven by powerful forces began to reshape and reconfigure this Arab Spring. I will focus on these external forces and how they interact with the domestic variables. One grand narrative of the region, of course, that has overtaken it is that the Arab Spring, in which its geopolitical dimension, in which the strategic interests of outside powers have intensified and redefined the internal conflicts between competing social forces in every setting. Another narrative, of course, is the sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shia Islam, which categorizes governments and societies in the Middle East alongside this polarizing axis of religious identity. And finally, a third narrative, and a broader one, is between Islamism and secularism, each of which claims to provide a vision of how best to organize society and politics in every country. We cannot deny that geopolitical reshaping, sectarian struggle, and the Islamist-secularist divide exist. They are social and historical realities, and their genesis and development are the subject and the object of much debate and research. However, we also must resist the temptation of reductionism, which sees conflictual arenas like Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia as little more than the manifestation of greater outside forces, such as local actors do not matter. The problem is that these narratives create the tendency to see outcomes before the processes, and thus impose a teleology that sees the ends before the means. They also deny autonomy to social actors, national governments, militants on the ground, and so perpetuate the long-standing idea, again, that Arabs cannot determine their own destiny. It is time that we review each domestic struggle on its own merit, on its own terms, to understand states and societies as how they have developed, and to emphasize the concept of process as much as the finality of outcome. In that sense, as observers of the region, as citizens who want to be empowered, or as normal individuals with very personal stakes in the region, in the future of the region, we must reclaim, reappropriate the Arab Spring. The progression from Syria to Egypt to Tunisia reveals an entire spectrum of outside intervention. The more the external forces intervene in a particular setting, the less autonomy the local actors retain, and the higher the risks for conflict between state and society. Of course, on one side of the spectrum, at one extremity, you find Syria. I will say something briefly about Syria. The Syrian civil war began as a social uprising in which Syrian citizens mobilized to demand dignity, citizenship to the act of civil disobedience. The excessively repressive response of the regime not only failed to crush the revolt, but it spread dissent to more citizens, more communities, in a brutal cycle of protest, repression, counter-protest, until it all blossomed into the full-scale civil war that we know. And as the civil war rages today, the geopolitical dimension and sectarian narratives are threatening to subsume the foundation as well as the trajectory of this conflict. External powers, in particular the US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, on one hand, and Iran on the other, have redrawn the Middle East into bipolar region cleaved between Sunni and Shia states, whereas each bloc represents a platform from which to extend dominance in the region. The Syrian civil war has become entangled in this discourse. The Syrian regime has been cast as a member of the Shia International, whatever that means, whereas various rebel groups play the roles of moderate or radical members of the Sunni camp. This is not merely an academic issue, ladies and gentlemen, for it has shaped the very trajectory and conduct of this war, with the Syrian regime receiving important material and symbolic support from fellow Shia bloc members, Iran and Hezbollah, whereas Saudi Arabia and other smaller Arab allies like Jordan have attempted to support their favored rebel groups through military and financial assistance. This does not mean that geopolitics never mattered and that sectarian tensions never existed in Syria. On the contrary, geopolitical interests have shaped Syrian foreign policy, as well as the treatment by outside powers of this country. Moreover, as we know, the country is a mélange between many religious identities, also, and many ethnic identities. Hence, local religious or ethnic tensions were conveyed through the invocation, through the summoning of ancient beliefs and identity politics. This has contributed to the fragmentation and degeneration of a civil war that has caused the death of more than 100,000 people, still counting. It has also obscured the important dynamics that will shape the future of this country. The conventional thinking views this civil war through the prism of a zero-sum game. Namely, if the regime is strong, then the opposition must be weak. If the regime is weak, then the opposition must be strong. I would offer an alternative view. Much like Afghanistan during the 1980s, the most important factor is not simply the external support or the coercive capacity of a single side, but also the diversity of the opposition, which encompasses numerous political and social agendas and numerous political cleavages. Hence, what we see is a prolonged stalemate as various factions combine and recombine in a very fluid political landscape. Indeed, this lack of opposition cohesion is a major reason why the regime has survived despite devastating destruction. The problem of the Syrian regime is not its lack of physical resources, but rather the human power, the human manpower, as it cannot sustain catastrophic casualties forever. This is why Hezbollah and Shibiha, irregular militias, are as prominent against the opposition as the regular army. The civil war also has different fronts, with those opposition groups fighting in the north, linking to Qatar and to Turkey, whereas those in the south of Syria are boosted by trilateral help in the form of Jordanian, Saudi, and CIA assistance. The future of this conflict reflects geopolitical and sectarian interests, but will also be determined by the behavior of the groups on the ground. Starting from the outside, the US does not wish to intervene, because doing so would ironically demonstrate its waning hegemony in the region. As a result, this type of American thinking has made it into the mainstream, into Washington. Such as Edward Luttwak recently in a Washington Post op-ed argued that the best option for American foreign policy is to perpetuate stalemate, to let each side bleed the other to a maximum. For its part, Saudi Arabia makes no secret that it would like to see the overthrow or the defeat of the Syrian regimes. But short of that, a fractured Syrian state that disrupts the emergence or the strength of the alleged Shia crescent is a second best solution. Paradoxically, however, by supporting the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it has weakened precisely this Sunni bloc. And ironically, by turning against a strong Sunni Islamist actor, it has unintentionally converged with Israeli interests. Iran and Russia would be content with a fractured state and would be satisfied if the Assad regime still governs a piecemeal state, like in the Afghani example. Given their acceptance of the fact, or rather, the recent US-Russian agreement was as much about chemical weapons as it was about the post-Assad, but not necessarily post-regime a new order. Given their acceptance of the fact that Assad may not survive, Russia sees a Taif-like agreement as the best way to resolve the conflict because it advantageously materializes the fracturing of Syria. It is often stated that Russia's interest in the Middle East or in Syria reflects its desire to remain relevant in the Middle East and to retain a strategic ally in the form of the Assad regime. However, what is understated is that Russia, much like the Soviet Union before it, is very preoccupied by protecting its soft geographic underbelly in the Caucasus from jihadi Salafism. Returning to the domestic dimension now, what can we project about the future of the civil war? We know that the government remains weaker than many thought, even perhaps with, according to some estimates, 200,000 potential casualties. They have fought the opposition into an impasse, into a stalemate. The use of chemical weapons reflects the necessity of escalation as they lack the human power to wage an all-out conventional war. Yet the lack of Western intervention has left the opposition in disarray and disappointment, with rebel groups divided along the Islamist secularist axis. Finally, it is difficult to parse out which opposition forces are truly ideologically motivated or else simply using religion for political gains, such as the difference between groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Dawat Islamiyya. Like many of the other uncertainties in Syria, this ambiguity will be as much determined by external forces as it will be determined by the internal dynamics on the ground. Syria is an exemplary case of a national struggle that was initially dominated by local voices, challenging state authority, but which now has become fragmented, unpredictable, and a bloody civil war. Beyond the carnage, however, there is another deeper strategy, that as the world debates the future of Syria, the world has forgot that the origin of this conflict stemmed from the basic drive for dignity and for voice, as seen in so many other countries, and had early on the potential of transforming peacefully. As we navigate across the spectrum of outside intervention, I'd like us to stop for a minute with Egypt, which, in my assessment, is in the middle of this spectrum of foreign intervention and local domestic agency. Egypt, as you well know, has seen a military coup in which the armed forces overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood. This past July, such an interruption, we have to say it from the beginning, from the outset, such an interruption of the constitutional process by extra-constitutional means is simply unacceptable under any circumstance. Though to a lesser degree than Syria, again, outside narratives have become entangled in domestic politics, with geopolitical competition and the Islamist secular division constituting the way in which the world has treated this coup. The US and its Western allies, along with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, my own country of Morocco, and Israel, for a different set of reasons, have all applauded the coup. They did so as they feared the consequences of an Islamist government they could not control, despite that this contradicted their interests in creating a cohesive Sunni bloc in the Middle East. The fact that many established democracies around the world welcomed and applauded this coup was also devastating, for it legitimizes the practice of taking power whenever the wrong side wins a democratic election. Internally, the coup stemmed from two parallel dynamics: a deteriorating economic situation, the perception that the Muslim Brotherhood's policy-making incompetence, with the latter especially being responsible for the erosion in its popularity internally. After all, how can Islam be the solution? Islam is the solution, the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. Be an operational slogan if after 1 year of governance, nothing is working. Infrastructure is not working, the economic crisis is continuing. Second, the coup stemmed from the conviction that the Brotherhood was being hegemonic, non-inclusive of other social groups and political forces in its government, which is a perfectly legitimate argument. However, part of that lack of inconclusiveness was driven by the institutional context. The Islamists were confounded by the deep state, including the military, the police, the judiciary, the fulul being the remnants of the old regime. As you well know, the term deep state comes from the Turkish example. Well, it turns out in Egypt, it wasn't just a deep state, it was a visible state. It was the same Ministry of Interior. The judiciary annulled part of the elections, which were founding elections, and so on and so forth. They reacted by turning inwards and becoming more insular, rather than reaching out to other allies among centrists, Salafis, and leftists. We know now the Brotherhood government not only surrendered its bunker mentality once it was too late, once the military had left its barracks and its own bunkers to seize power once again. We know now that the Egyptian military has closely coordinated with Tamarrud movement and so-called liberals, many of whom showed that their liberalism was quite thin. These liberals, not all, many of them are very brave and very strong, but the majority that call themselves liberals want social pluralism so that they can articulate their views freely, but not political pluralism that would result in an Islamist government they cannot control. The coup made also for strange bedfellows, as both Salafists and the Coptic Church supported the military takeover, wrongly thinking that military authoritarianism would better support their interests. For this reason, the Tamarrud movement did not have much overlap with the youth in Tahrir Square, who were the first victims of the repression once the Brotherhood fell. The result today is that Egypt is ruled by an established military regime that runs counter to liberalism, greater censorship than in the Mubarak era, and the emergence of a chauvinistic and nationalistic discourse that supplants the Islamist one. In that discourse, the Egyptian military is attempting to play the role of the Nasserist regime, but with a key difference. Instead of pan-Arab nationalism calling for regional unity, it is exploiting xenophobic nationalism to bolster its internal legitimacy. The army may be in charge due to the exhaustion of all other sectors, the defeat of the Muslim Brotherhood that we just said, the lack of any other default political option. However, returning to the original situation, or that is restoring the pre-Arab status quo, the pre-Arab Spring status quo, even in an autocratic context like Egypt, cannot happen. Why? Because new spaces of public and political contention that have opened up now can only be closed at a very high price of coercion and repression. Egypt now has reached a critical juncture in terms of the kind of regime it wants after the Arab Spring. It can return to a Mubarak-style regime by having General Sisi govern in civilian clothes, or it can adopt Pakistani model with limited pluralism and a facade of civilian rule, where the army controls the essential levers of power and retains ultimate veto power. Neither option may be tenable economically, but outside interests militate strongly against any further adventurism with democracy, which means that most Egyptians today are stuck with options they did not choose and they did not want. Furthermore, the Western and especially the Sunni bloc have accepted the downfall of the Islamist narrative, even though the new xenophobic national discourse is very disruptive. For it calls the Brotherhood as an arm of the Palestinians, as an arm of the Syrian regime, as an arm of Western interests with Qatari financial support. The new narrative also questions the very citizenship of every Egyptian that speaks out against this new government in a very cruel reversal and betrayal of the original spirit of the Arab Spring. However, the legacy of mobilization, as I was just saying, from the Arab Spring has irrevocably opened up political spaces of contention which allow people to mobilize, to challenge this new political order, and thus try to create a new future for themselves. The best proof of this lies in the fact that even the military was forced to justify its action and its intervention as a democratic initiative summoned by popular mandate. On the other side of the aisle, the coup debunked the Brotherhood era of invincibility. Many suspected that Islamists around the region were an international, or rather that the engine of this intervention was even the Brotherhood. Well, as we see today, there was no revolutionary potential and no military resources. Never before in 3 decades have the Muslim Brotherhood been in such a weak position. Literally thousands of cadres are now in jail, which means that the revolutionary potential was not really there. This fight between the Cobra and the Mongoose goes back all the way to the Nasserist regime. In reality, the Brotherhood was a human organization with mundane flows that proved fatal, and which facilitated its swift defeat. Yet this development also shows a deep contradiction within the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood's brief time in power was not one of Islamizing, it was one of Ikhwanizing. It was not one of ideological imposition, or rather, I should say, theocratic imposition. It was rather one of organizational takeover. Consider that the military early on was content with a tame Islamist government and only launched a coup when it felt that its underlying interests were threatened. As their edifice collapsed, the Brotherhood fell back on the discourse of legitimacy, Shar'iyya, rather than a discourse of Islamic law, Sharia, which was the clearest sign that they had lost religious monopoly over the meaning of God's will. This is part of the Arab Spring's enduring legacy, whereby the opening of new spaces of political mobilization enabled the rise of new social actors, like the Salafists and their successful political party, to challenge this monopoly of the Brotherhood on religious discourse. This also stemmed from the refusal of the traditional sectors in the religious sphere, in the leadership of Al-Azhar University, to embrace the same monopoly on the religious discourse, which the Brotherhood claimed to have. Because of this diversification of the religious discourse, I doubt that an Algerian scenario will emerge in Egypt. Part of the Brotherhood may go through a communitarian withdrawal. Others in the Brotherhood may explore forms of renewal. Others may join the insurgency in the Sinai, depending on how fierce the military repression is there. Egypt's future is more promising than Syria in the short term due to the absence of open conflict, but nonetheless remains permeated by external forces. The military leadership, backed by Western and Sunni bloc interests, will not surrender power voluntarily. This much is evident. And as a result, we will see increased social protest as more Egyptians attempt to keep spaces of political contestation open. The atmosphere of political polarization will deepen, in the short run at least, which means the marginalization of many median position between nationalism and radical Islamism is virtually absent. One fundamental question is how to deal with such polarization, which may be fueled from the outside, but which can only be mended and only be healed from the inside. The hatred that many Egyptians showed towards the Brotherhood, which manifests itself in such acts as the cheering of the killing of Islamists on the street, must be addressed. After all, Islamists are not the object of such hatred in other Arab countries with Brotherhood organizations, such as, for instance, Jordan or Kuwait. Egypt, thus, to wrap up the section on Egypt, has experienced less external permeation and mediation than Syria, but nonetheless remains influenced by the familiar patterns of outside intervention, whether the geopolitical game, the rift between Shia and Sunni Islam, compounded by Western interests of stability, and the ideological backlash of Islamism. Navigating to the final node on the spectrum, which for me is Tunisia, I will say a few words on Tunisia. The Tunisian context is more promising in terms of seeing indigenous actors pushing democratic development forward. Though still firmly in the shadow, or rather in the sphere of influence of France, unlike Syria or Egypt, Tunisia seldom was a battleground for these competing geopolitical battles due to its location. And neither was it a nexus of competing sectarian or ethnic battles. The primary cleavage in Tunisian politics has been and still remains the Islamist secularist divide. But here the country's isolation from outside actors has enabled the elaboration of compromises which are lacking elsewhere. Tunisian politics now revolve around the surviving but sometimes very uneasy and tense modus vivendi between Islamists and secular forces. As you know, when Nahda won its inaugural elections and secured a popular mandate, but in the eyes of its adversaries, it mistakenly thinks that this means a mandate to hegemonically, in a hegemonic way, dominate the state. There's so many countrymen in this room that sometimes the French accent comes. Also creating social tensions was the rise of violent Salafist groups, which, unlike Egypt, denounced political participation through elections or institutions. A process of introspection, and here Nahda played strategically very different than the Muslim Brotherhood. They paused, looked, and they saw this was unsustainable. And so a process of introspection following the attack on the American embassy in Tunisia forced Nahda to realize it could not govern alone, and also gave other opposition forces the impetus to continue pushing and a diverse coalition for government. In this moment of reckoning, most political actors chose a path of compromise rather than confrontation. Challenging the Troika are many organizations in civil society that are very vibrant, like the UGTT, like the women's organizations, like Nida Tunis as a political coalition. They all have surged in strength and mobilization. All these social actors help to ensure that public spaces of protest and political venues of participation remains open, contested, and protected. I will finish by saying it does not mean that Tunisia has passed the storm and that all problems are solved and behind us. Its problems are not minor procedural issues of democratic transition, for there have been real moments of uncertainty and mistakes made by all sides. However, even though political development in Tunisia since its revolution has occasionally veered off, this does not mean the pathway itself is flawed. There is enough compromise, enough engagement among political actors and vitality in these forces to push the process forward. We should notice again that the Tunisian case is one of relative insulation from the complicating external narratives that have plagued the other transitional settings. There is neither sectarian overlay nor outside intervention, for instance, from the US or the Gulf, openly funding favored groups or even the government. Though compromise is slow, there is real promise and hope in the Tunisian case, because when left to their own devices, domestic actors and competing groups find ways to compromise atop promising political foundation. What's important also is the role of the armed forces. The armed forces, for a variety of reasons, have stayed on the sidelines and are much smaller than elsewhere and have a history of non-intervention in the political domain, and the military leadership has firmly stated that it does not wish to intervene in politics. competing social and political forces have found the breathing room to find compromise, partly because the domestic arena has been free from these manipulations which we talked about. Here, there is another kind of challenge in this situation which is devoid of foreign intervention. The challenge for citizens is to remain constantly engaged, irregardless of the pacting and the bargaining that's happening at the elite level. It is important to remain engaged as nascent democratic institutions take root. So in conclusion, the Arab Spring has been and will be a long process, a process rather than outcome. As we observe this ongoing and open-ended process, we must remember the imperative to challenge the assumptions given to us by the outside forces. We must also critically question how these struggles for dignity and voice have been framed for us to accept. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So now we move into the question and Q&A session of the presentation. Thank you, Prince Moulay Hicham, for a great speech. The way we are going to do this is we're going to take some questions online, and then we'll take also some questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question live, please line up behind the mic over there. We have two mics actually, one here, one there. And while this process is going on, I would like, as the moderator, to give myself the right of the first question. One of the things that I found interesting, one comment that I found interesting was what you said about how it is advantageous for Russia to have a Ta'if-like setup in Syria. My understanding of the Ta'if agreement is it was a power-sharing agreement, and this essentially means that the power of the Ba'athi, of the Assad regime will inherently be curbed and limited. So in light of this, why would this still be advantageous to Russia? Maybe it's not on.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Everything is so complicated at Harvard. In that context, I was talking about, look, what is not stressed is the fact that that Russia is very worried, I think, about the Caucasus and about the fact that Salafi jihadism can thrive and can spread there. If they can keep because in their eyes, and it's normal, anything that's going to come and come after this regime will be something that is going to be a Sunni regime that may be also very staunch and very religiously oriented in the beginning, given the trajectory of the conflict. So in the eyes of Syria, if we can have something that's very fractured, like in Afghanistan, just after the retreat of the Soviet Union, just before the fall of Najibullah and even afterwards, then that will keep a weak state that will not be able to project any kind of militancy outside. Now, of course, that remains all theoretical. We don't know how matters will play out in Syria, but probably what we're looking at is a regime that may be entirely Sunni, or a transition with a kind of multi-ethnic, multi-identity confessional regime that will usher in the transition. Of course, this can take time. We don't know how long. Even if Assad is finished, the end game may, like in chess, last 10 years.
Exactly, which links up to what you said earlier, that this is a process, not necessarily an outcome.
Yeah, and in the case of Syria, I was talking about the Arab Spring in general. In the case of Syria, it's a very tragic process.
Indeed. Start with the first question there.
Hello, everyone.
Your name
first,
and your
okay.
affiliation, please.
My name is Siham, and I'm a student at UMass Boston. And I would like to first present my thanks for the very thorough analysis that we got for everything that's been happening and the idiosyncrasies in the Arab world and kind of what Arab Spring has brought to the Arab world. I would like to bring it full circle, however, and go back to the what you referred to earlier as the Harvard Moroccan Week, and bring it back to Morocco. As the Arab Spring has also, or the Middle East and North Africa Spring has also kind of made its way to Morocco. I just have a question, which I'm not explaining it, but I am a big fan of your theorem of the democratic paradigm and your idea as to kind of how to bring the Middle East and countries of North Africa to a level where they are democratic countries able to provide, where people are able to live out their citizenship and enjoy their full rights of citizenship with equal rights, and where everybody's kind of being equal. That brings me to one thing. I have a question first, is that why haven't you come out flat out and said that the monarchy system, which is the heart of Morocco, being an authoritarian system, being a totalitarian system, is something that is against everything that the democracy that you envision the Arab world to be living in, that is something that will hinder the development or kind of the progression of democracy as you see it? And thank you for this question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I think I said my views on the Moroccan monarchy over the record very clear. In fact, so clear that I've been, in a sense, forced to take a little distance from my own country because of it. Okay. Now, the question which you pose is about monarchy versus republic. I happen to think, in the conjuncture of today, may not be the case tomorrow, that the easiest path for Morocco to have a democracy, to be able to build a democracy, is with the monarchical institution, with a constitutional monarchy. It may not be the case tomorrow, but today. Now, monarchies are not exceptions, they're not divine, they're human constructions. People have built them, and they can be fashioned by people, and they can be eradicated by people if they're not viable anymore. That's a decision for the Moroccan people to take ultimately. And as a Moroccan, I would respect that the day were to come. I seriously think that Moroccans, Jordanians, everybody, have outgrown the institutions they're living in. Morocco Morocco can live without a monarchy. That's not a problem. The problem is what is the less costly path towards the democracy. I happen to think, in the context of today, still reforming the monarchy is the easiest path, is the less costly path to...
Do you believe it's reformable now?
I think the system is not reformable. I think the system has a lot of problems, cannot be reformed easily, but it won't happen overnight, and it needs a lot of pressure. It needs a process of imposition. And the forces that are present today, forces in civil society and forces outside of the political system, are the forces that are going to bring about change, not the forces inside the political game. Because those that are inside the political game are essentially about cooptation, about government portfolios, about the privileges of power, about the economic perks, and not about change. And I've said that before. And let me just say this. If a time comes when it becomes abundantly clear, and it could become abundantly clear, like in Iran, where the monarchy is not viable anymore, out of decency and out of respect to Moroccans, I think I should be the last one to theorize about that. Out of respect, not just to my family, out of respect to Moroccans, I will be the last one theorizing, well, this is how a republic should look. Moroccans are adults, they're seeking to be citizens, to be empowered, and ultimately it's their decision under what regime they want to be built. And if the monarchy cannot reform itself, and if the monarchy is faced with such a catastrophic perspective, well, what can I say? Tough luck.
Thank you.
I can't be more explicit.
Let's move to a question. Let's move to a
I
question on
cannot be
Pigeonhole.
more explicit, not out of fear. Frankly, I'm not, knowledge and the presence of people here impress me, but not power or, or dirty tactics. I'm not impressed by that.
I'm not allowed to ask another question, which would be derivative.
Well, it's fine. You can try and have it later. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So we'll take a question from Pigeonhole here. What does Your Royal Highness think of Saudi Arabia rejecting the seat they were offered at the United Nations Security Council? And what has happened about Morocco joining the GCC?
Boy, that's two questions in one.
Well, we allowed it over there, so we figure we're allowing it
Well, you know the Saudi official position. The official position about the seat is that the Syrian people are being butchered. The Palestinian problem is not being solved. The Security Council is about hegemonic politics and Security Council nation politics with veto power. All those are valid realities, but I still think, you don't leave the chair open. You militate and you advocate those very things on the Security Council, and many people do that. But Saudi Arabia is a sovereign country; it can decide what it wants. Having said that, Saudi Arabia has a lot of challenges in front of it. The challenge, demographics of building a real democratic institutions, of seeing beyond, this position of resistance to change, because it can rely on resources. Sooner or later, it's going to have to start exploring a way to opening up its system. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to keep in mind too.
And what has happened about Morocco joining the GCC? Any knowledge there?
Well, as a Moroccan, I can say this. Joining the GCC, if this is going to give us, any economic advantages, that's for technocrats to decide, and it's for technocrats to crunch out the numbers. Having said this, I would hate for my country to join the GCC because it's a monarchy joining the monarchy's club, a monarchy joining a counter-revolutionary cartel. I wouldn't want that to happen, with my respect to everyone involved. But at the end of the day, if we are to join the GCC, that is something that needs to be submitted to popular referendum because it's an important decision. Mm-hmm. And it's up to the Moroccan people to decide, and politicians can lobby, politicians can try to persuade their constituencies the advantages or the disadvantages of joining such a group. But I personally would be reluctant to join a club of monarchies. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Sumaira. I thank the Prince for his...
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Sorry. My name is Ibrahim Sumaira. I'm originally Palestinian, and I'm an American citizen. I thank you so much for such a refreshing speech, a ray of light in between all this corruption in the Arab world. Really do appreciate it. We don't have many voices to listen to that bring out such a positive, such a realistic light to what is happening from an intellectual mind. My question refers to your comments on Egypt. You commented saying that, if I understood correctly, that the Muslim Brotherhood has lost its popularity. And the Muslim Brotherhood happens to counter the argument saying that it did not lose its popularity, it wasn't given a chance in governance, since, as you mentioned, the structure was the same. The structure of governance was not changed to the point where they could govern properly. Now, we're looking at a time, we're looking at a 20-year frame for change, or a 10-year frame, whatever you want to say, whatever you want to go to in terms of time. But the idea is that Islamism will be alive during
Which one
that.
is what?
Islamism will be alive during that time frame. And do you also take out this? My question is, do you take out the option of a Muslim Brotherhood 4.0 or a 10.0 or whatever you want to call it, running the Arab world as it is, as popular as today? Because we might neglect in this audience the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood may have lost its popularity. May accept that it lost its popularity, but the protests in Egypt that have been lasting for 3 months, and Rabaa and all the people that died there still stand and tell you that the popularity is still
So the question is,
alive. So where do you see the option of Islamism, a more modernized Islamism form, similar to Turkey or Malaysia, happening in the Arab world?
Thank you.
Well, in the beginning of the Arab Spring, I said something which was, I thought, very risky, but I'm pretty much at rest with what I said. I think revolutionary Islamism is finished, but parliamentary Islamism is here to stay for a long time. Now, what you have now in Egypt is an army coming in force. An army that is not just an organized institution with the means of violence, but we should remember this at all times. The Egyptian army is part of the fabric of that country. It is a constitutive component of that country. It has built that country. It's just not an organized force defending national sovereignty and so forth. It is part of the building block, a little like the Algerian army. So we must keep in mind that is not an ordinary army. It has a history, it has a trajectory. My sense of what's going to happen in Egypt, I think this is something that's going to have to run its course, unfortunately. I think we're seeing a military regime with the contours of real fascism, and it's very problematic. Everything's a conspiracy. There are outside enemies everywhere. I think the Egyptian military, like any military in the world, cannot govern a country. Arab armies excel at divide and rule politics. So I think we're going to see a lot of that in the coming time. But I think ultimately, they will need to reach some kind of an agreement with the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood is not going away. And maybe it'll take 6 months, it'll take 6 years, it'll take 5 years, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I see a fundamental agreement between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, something of a finally historic pact that will allow for the incubation of other liberal forces to come, to take root, and to start participating in public life. The problem with these transitions, and the problem with the Egyptian transition, is that there was no pacting to begin with. This is a problem with all of our transitions. We need, sometimes you need strategic bargaining. So what they did is they partitioned the country. They didn't pack the country. They didn't see the country holistically. Okay, we have enclaves of power, we have this, what can we do? And these pacts usually take form, and they're usually undone over a period of 5, 10 years. We've seen this in Latin America, to bring about democracy and reassure everybody that, we're going to move the process forward. Essentially, there was an agreement, but it was an agreement of partition. It wasn't a contractual agreement about a pact, about a contract. Talk about, we're in the law school. That's what it is. Sometimes democracy through undemocratic means. So there hasn't been any of that. But at the same time, these are symbiotic forces. They know each other for so long. And eventually, they know that they can do this. The Muslim Brothers cannot do this without the army. And the army knows that at the end of the day, it's going to sit and needs to talk to the Islamists. Now, on the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a Nahda. They have to go back to their books, and they have to start answering serious questions. It's very politically and intellectually a very poor platform. The only political literature that the Muslim Brotherhood has is the Sayyid Qutb book. Al-Nahda Ghanouchi was supposed to talk here, had 10 books just to himself. I mean, it's important to know some renewal. And it's important to know one thing. The region is knowing autonomy between the religious and the political sphere. That doesn't mean it's laïcité à la française. It means that there is secularization, spheres of accommodation and of compromise. So all these are parameters that are come into play at one point or another.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take one on Vision Hall. Salafism, Shiism, pro-hijab, pro-niqab. Why have the liberals lost? What explains the rise of Islam? What happened to the moderation of the 50s?
The moderation of the 50s.
I wasn't born back then, so I can't really speak to that.
Well, I think that's a very important, I think what happens, can you hear me now? I think, let me do this, okay. Princeton ingenuity. I think there was a process of secularization in the 50s and 60s. But keep in mind, that was not modernity. It was also a form of modernity, but it was also very superficial modernity. It wasn't about citizenship, and it wasn't about emancipation. It was about imposing on society by modernizers a kind of ideology of secularism. So that didn't take root. That could not take root. And also what's important to know is that Islamism has many cultural features in our society it can rely on. It can rely on the family, it can rely on the patriarchal structures of our societies, it can rely on the mosque, it can rely on all sorts of features in our society that give it strength. And in fact, it can even rely on nationalism, which is secularizers or the modernizers have launched and championed in the 15th or 16th. A lot of the Islamist movements are those that carried the torch of nationalism and liberation in the Arab world after the decline. Hezbollah was also a nationalist movement. Mm-hmm. The Iranian Revolution played the role of nationalism, lifted the ban of nationalism at a certain point. So we have to keep in mind, why has liberalism not succeeded in taking root? Here's a clear example, a clear lesson we can learn from. How did the Arab Spring start? The Arab Spring started with secular, young men and women in Tahrir Square, in Yemen, in Casablanca, everywhere. But they have relinquished their positions. They have withdrawn. They have not organized into organizations. They have not continued their pedagogic mission. At the end of the day, the traditional political parties came up and stole the show. Mm-hmm. So if you can't organize, you can't carry your thoughts forward. Mm-hmm. That's another idea to keep in mind. To finish that, today we have large westernized segments in our society that have internalized this secularism. And the difference today is that there is enough critical mass to these sectors in society to really organize. And it's not correlated with class anymore. These are not ghettos in Casablanca or Amman or Rabat. Mm-hmm. These are sectors that cut across regions and that even extend in the Badia or in the Reef. Mm-hmm. So there is a dynamic going on. But we should remember that secularization is a process of compromises between how we live our religion and how we live our politics. We cannot assume that our trajectory is going to be exactly the same as in the Western worlds, because we do not have the same initial conditions. Mm-hmm. We do not have a pope, we do not have clergy, we do not have the Age of Enlightenment, we do not have capitalism as it existed. So our initial conditions are different. But this process is ongoing, I think.
مساء الخير. أنا عبد الرحمن الأسعد. I am a Palestinian refugee, grew up in Damascus. First of all, I would like to share my very deep disappointment in this snack that was offered outside, because I was looking for hummus all the time. I didn't find any. So this is something to be considered for next weekend.
We'll keep that in
However,
mind.
I would like to thank the Equitable and the organizing committee for that. Please cheer it up for them. I am very inspired and honored to be here today. My question to you, sir, you have given us a very dense explanation about what the region is going through at the moment. And then you stated multiple future scenarios about where the region is going. And as an 18-year-old man, like, I look at it, I'm like, where are we going to be? What I am really concerned about is creative solutions that may involve me as a young man in changing the reality of the Arab world. And I'm asking you this question, whether you have provided multiple scenarios or possible scenarios, but I'm asking for creative solutions that may involve the young people here who are just like me, very desperate to help the Middle East, or to support the Middle East, or to contribute back to where we came from. Thanks a lot again, and thanks a lot for organizing this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that. I'm sorry about the hummus. I love hummus. Okay. And I love Palestinian hummus. It's got less tahina in it.
My pleasure.
So that's just my... look, I think you're very right to be angry and very right to be frustrated. Generation just before you, I think you're 18. The generations before you, I mean, decades and generations have been lost in the Arab world for nothing. I think I'm going to say something that at the same time can be abstract, maybe too abstract, but it's not. It's enormously practical. There's nothing we cannot do in this region, but we can only do it if we are free, if we have real citizenship. Everything else is technocratic. I mean, we can bring, MOOC to the Middle East, as Her Majesty called it, but there's a big moose in the room, and that's the mukhabarat, and so forth. And it's true. We cannot import the tools of modernity without importing the substance of modernity. Okay? That's not going to happen. We can bring in the internet, we can wire everybody, and it can be sexy and slick and cool and all this. We're not going to go anywhere if at the end of the day, these are not served to empower people to build viable systems. Okay? I'm sorry, I said it's abstract. I may have answered your question or not. I answered the question the way I see it. It may not be satisfactory to you, but I hope at least I shed a little light.
Thanks, all. I appreciate it. Thank you.
But just as a follow-up, though, where do you see the concept of equitable education? Where do you see that playing a role in initiating this discourse that you are basically saying is the beginning to everything?
Well, first of all, we have a real problem with our educational systems. And we have to say something frankly about our educational systems. Our educational systems are not about producing skills, but rather about producing diplomas. And that's very different. Why? Because there's a tacit pact, or part of the way that the leaderships and these regimes have addressed their population was saying, look, tacitly, we're going to let you go to these, and we're going to subsidize all these educational programs, and you're going to have diplomas, and you're going to have the same diplomas the minister has, and so forth. But it's part of a bargain. And a counterpart to that, you will have to be quiet and shut up. At the end of the day, we have diplomas, but we have no skills. Mm-hmm. And there's so many other skills that we can do that have diplomas that are less prestigious, but again, prestige is a perception. It is a construction. We can deconstruct that to mean something else. To be prestigious is to have a job. Mm-hmm. But any government that does that is a government that needs to have a popular mandate because it needs to sell that. I mean, that has worked in other countries like Indonesia and South Korea. But at the end of the day, it will cost whatever government goes through that until the mentality changes. But you can't do that unless you have a real democratic mandate for a government to do it.
Okay.
My name is Hayel. I'm Syrian Jordanian. I would like to address you as Royal Highness, but I would like to speak to the human Moulay. I want to share with everybody an experience in September. I was privileged to go to Jordan for 2 weeks, during which I was honored to help some Syrian refugee families. I'll try to make my voice less trembling as possible because I'm just, the Photoshop and the photos are going through again. Those Syrians who managed to flee from Syria, from rape, torture, arrest, oppression, are being put in prostitution in those hosting countries that are bragging about how Syrian refugees are causing them economic conflict. I have this story to share. I have a couple of questions.
Just make the story quick, huh?
I finished
You
my
finished
story.
the story, okay,
My
go
story
ahead.
is, what are we doing to Syrians and other Arabs? We have quarter of a population displaced internally and outside the country. Two questions. Do you see any Syrian elections 2014? And where you see Syria in 10 years? I have a humble invitation to invite you for a non-for-profit project we're establishing in Switzerland. And I would kindly ask everybody, this is a great opportunity for plus 800 Arabs who are here. If we can stand for a moment of silence for all those souls which went and died for dignity and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will entertain your suggestion for later in the program, but for now, let's try and answer your question.
First of all, I can't say I feel your pain because it's very real, but I imagine your pain. And I'm extremely, you have my solidarity, you have my sympathy, my deference. It's really tragic. I know what's happening. I don't know. I imagine what's happening. Where can your country go? I think it's real. It's a tremendous hypocrisy we've been living through. And I think no Syrian, at least any Syrian I know, no Syrian has asked for a Westerner or another Arab to come and fight his war for him. No. But I think there's certainly a middle ground between doing nothing and intervening. We could have helped collectively, individually, Syrian people with weapons, with logistic, short of outside intervention. I think any outside intervention is grave because it raises real problems. It raises the specter of countries having real agendas behind their intervention, that at the end of the day, the right or the duty to protect can be offset by the harm that we can create. But short of intervention, we could have helped serious groups with, let's say it frankly, with weapons and all sorts of humanitarian aid. The argument that this ends up in the hands of Al-Qaeda is a false argument, because if you ask security experts, and I've asked a lot of them, the arsenals of ACME in Mali and so forth did not come from whatever weapons they got from Qatar and so forth. They came from the arsenals of Gaddafi. The same thing everywhere else. It's the same story. It's a regime that loses its weapons to Al-Qaeda and terrorists. So that is not an argument for me. I also think, and it's important to keep in mind, that part of the solution lies also in the Alawite community. And I think the opposition has not worked hard enough inside the Alawi community, because they know that once Assad goes, they will be the biggest victims. Ultimately, when this finishes, you will need some kind of UN protection or regional protection to help the Alawite community not to be slaughtered. So I think part of the solution is with the Alawite community. Another solution, I think, which is desperately needed, is some kind of unity or some kind of real dialogue and coordination between the opposition that is outside, that is talking to these regimes and talking to the international stage, and inside, there's absolutely no dialogue. Another final thing. In front of these channels of help, how is the Syrian Free Army helped? It is helped essentially by middlemen going with bags of money across, especially the Turkish border or down in the Saudi border. There's no coordination. There's no synchronization. On the other side, you have an extremely lean machine run by Hezbollah and run by, and run by Syria and run by the Republican Guard in Iran and run by the shadow commander, which is Qasim Soleimani, which is has basically turned or reversed the course of the war because they have been so organized and they have been very efficient. They have dismantled the Syrian army into different militias. The Syrian army today is fighting as militias. It's not fighting as a standing army anymore. And that is because of the Republican Guard and because of the Hezbollah cadres who have known how to adapt the war tactics to the new challenge. So these are a lot of dimensions going on. All we need to do is to take the decision to help the Syrian people, fight this war, not with intervention, but at least help, and at least it'll give him a hand to bargain with Assad. Even to bargain, even for peace, you need to be able to say no. You can't bargain a good contract, as you know in the law school, if you can't say no. Mm-hmm. So anyways, this is a multifaceted answer to a very complicated.
Thank you. We are out of time. Thank you so much for being with us today and for very insightful comments.
I'd like to say one thing before I go. Thank you very much. I have omitted to say that this is the first time that Moroccan state finances and resources are in a way responsible in an indirect way for my presence here. Usually state expenditures are used for a different treatment of my person. So I cherish that. Well,
1 second, I'm going to as a thank you, we have this placard for you, to thank you for all your time and effort here with us today. Thank you. Thank you so much.